Up, here we go. I don't even have to make a guess. Jared Blikre has the numbers. Apple second quarter earnings out. Jared, take it away.
Yes, it is a beat on both their top and bottom line. You can see the stock surging there over 3% in after-hours trading. Their second quarter EPS was $2.46 when the estimate was for $2.37, and their revenue for the quarter was $58 billion when the estimate was for only $57.49 billion. In terms of what they're seeing for the third quarter, the current quarter, they're looking for $52.5 billion to $54.5 billion, and that is the estimate was for the low end of that, $52.22 billion. So the guidance there a little bit higher than the street expected. Second service revenue expecting $11.45 billion. And we're seeing an iPhone breakout in terms of revenue. Of course, we're not going to get the unit sales here, but for the second quarter, their revenue for the iPhone was $31.05 billion. That beats the estimate of $30.50 billion. And just a couple more numbers here. They're seeing in the current quarter gross margin to be 37 to 38% when the estimate was for 38%. And shares surging now, as you can see on your screen, over 5% up to 212, and nice run for Apple here. All
right, Jared Blikre live in our newsroom. Thanks so much. A couple other headlines coming out looking to boost the dividend, 77 cents a share from 73 cents. Apple to buy back an added 75 billion in shares. Dan Flax is here with us. Dan, we're going to get the full report, dive into that. But from what you've heard, especially on the guidance front for third quarter, coming in a little bit above where the street was. What's your first blush here, your first take?
Jen, I think overall this is a pretty good set of results considering that the environment, of course, remains quite difficult as if we think about markets like China. But if we step back and think about what's going on, this is really a device and services company that's broadening its set of offerings. We all appreciate that the iPhone is a bit softer now. Remember, of course, it had strong growth last year, so they're tougher compares. But you're seeing growth in services, newer areas like the watch, like AirPods. I think over time that can help them extend into newer markets like healthcare. And so the company is continuing to innovate and really integrate hardware, software, and services in a way that users appreciate, they value, and ultimately the ecosystem, in our view, remains healthy, despite of course, what is somewhat of a choppy environment.
Yeah, Apple calling out 1.4 billion active devices. It's an all-time high for them, all-time record for its services unit, saying they had their best year for iPad growth in 6 years. A little throwback there for the company.
Yeah,
so congrats to the iPad for having a big year. But I think overall, it continues to amaze that Apple came out January the 2nd, cuts their guidance, says everything's terrible. We think there's basically a global recession going on, particularly in China. The stock is now up 50+% from that time. And Dan, it's almost like it never happened in a way.
Well, I think that given the volatility of the business, because you have vicious seasonality, if you like, into the holiday season, and then we spend part of the rest of, or the first half of the following year guessing what it looks like on the way down. And so the company doesn't always have great visibility. And so, yes, to your point, I mean, there was a lot of weakness and then ultimately the pre-announcement. But from the work we have been doing on the company, and when we think about where they're creating value, in a market, of course, like smartphones that's very competitive, this integration, this building of the hardware, the software, and the services, pulling it together in a way that people appreciate, that's ultimately what we think is going to continue to create value. And so if we look out over the next couple of years, we have clearly new offerings in areas like video and gaming. We'll get pricing, I'm sure, later this year. But if Apple, in the case of video, can come up with differentiated content that its users appreciate, we think that will both keep the users happy, it'll attract new users, and ultimately Apple will find new ways to add value in people's lives. Payments, of course, is another way. I find myself often using the watch as it happens to make payments, be it in the drugstore or taxis or whatnot. So there's a lot of interesting optionality here, if you will.
But Dan, speak to us. We haven't mentioned China at all yet in this discussion, and we do see in the report that weakness is still there overall, and sales in China dropped by 26.7% during the last quarter. Of course, that was all we talked about last quarter. Do you feel like that was a blip? Suddenly, the Chinese economy isn't just going to be roaring again, even if it is feeling a little bit stronger than perhaps the last 2 quarters.
I think that's right. I think China remains a risk. I think Last year, the company actually performed quite well, and so the decline this year or in the recent quarter looks even worse, if you will. And so I think ultimately, if Apple is able to grow the install base in China, if the App Store there and the services ecosystem is healthy, that suggests that even though the device sales are weak, we think that ultimately the company can add value to customers in that market. And so if you really were to look out over the next 18 months, if they can continue to execute on the product cycle and the user install base is growing, users are satisfied, then even in China, I think we will get back to growth at some point. But in the near term, to be clear, it is a difficult environment. Competition there remains fierce, and Apple really needs to continue to execute as best as it can.
Yeah, looking at Apple shares here, again, up 4% after hours after the company beating on the top and the bottom line, $2.46 per share in earnings, $58 billion in revenue, both of those topped estimates. iPhone sales also beating estimates in its quarter, $31 billion versus $30.5 for the street. Services revenue, $11.45 billion. The street was looking for 11.2. So if Apple has four lines that we look at, Jen, for expectations, 4 for 4. Nice job.
I would love to ask.
As they say in the community, great quarter, guys.
Oh, yeah, great quarter. Well, we'll probably hear that on the call.